So welcome to the opening plenary of the Media Futures Conference. I am Miriyam and I'm a professor here at the LSE, and it's a great pleasure and honor to chair this panel with three wonderful speakers who I will introduce in a minute. Before I do so, I would just like to say a couple of words about the concept of this panel. So this panel, as you know, is titled Remembering Mediapolis, Media Morality and Disrupted Futures. And this panel is inspired by Roger Silverstone's legacy and his ethical and political imagination. Roger Silverstone, as many of you know, was the founding head of department in 2003, 20 years ago. That was our birthday. And in fact, today we don't only celebrate the department's birthday, but also Roger's birthday as well. From his insightful research on media and everyday life to his radical conception of mediation and his thought-provoking media ethics, Silverstone's work has been hugely influential around the world. I was truly privileged to work closely with him as his PhD student and also as a postdoctoral researcher a long time ago. Looking back, I now appreciate even more his perceptive, sharp, and most certainly his ethical scholarship. I didn't meet many people in British academia back then that thought that migration and diaspora had anything to do with media and communications. Yet Roger was always willing and persistent in asking questions about the stakes embedded in researching voice and silencing and recognition and misrecognition of those at the margins of the national, Western-centric and commodified media environment. In his book, Media and Morality on the Rise of Mediapolis, he emphasizes the urgency of these questions, specifically when he discusses whether and how the global spaces of mediated connectivity can become spaces of ethical connection, of dialogue and mutual understanding, of voice and recognition. Almost 20 years on, of course, this agenda remains as urgent as ever. And at the same time, of course, so much has changed since Silverstone's Mediapolis. And we're now called to reflect back and to reflect forward, to think what our normative frameworks do not do, and what they need to do in order to understand our media environments. And especially to understand how we can meaningfully contribute to public conversations. Even more so now, at times of intensified inequalities, racial discrimination, misogyny, and transphobia, and when the repressive data and algorithmic economies have so much to do with the way we converse on social media, but even more so with the way in which we live in, with, and against our social and natural worlds. With these issues in mind, the overarching question for this panel is the present and future of media ethics. What is media ethics for? Do we still need a media ethics lens to tackle the big challenges for media presence and futures? Our plenary speakers will tackle these questions from their different perspectives in their introductory comments. They will have about 10-11 minutes to do so. I might then return with a question or two, and then we will open the floor to the audience. So let me briefly introduce our wonderful speakers. So in order of presentations, I will start with Jonathan Ong, who is an associate professor of global digital media at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. He researches global media ethics, digital politics, and the anthropology of humanitarianism. In his most recent research on disinformation, Jonathan uses ethnography to understand the social identities, work arrangements, and moral justifications of paid trolls and political public relations strategies. He's the author and editor of 3 books, and his latest book is titled Trolls for Sale. Nick Couldry, next to me, is professor in media communications and social theory at the LSE. In recent years, his work has increasingly focused on data questions and the ethics, politics, and deep social implications of big data and small data practices. He's the author and editor of 15 books, and his latest book with Ulysses Mejias is The Cost of Connection: How Data Colonizes Human Life and Appropriates It for Capitalism. And on my right, Miriyam Aouragh. is a reader in digital anthropology of the Middle East at the University of Westminster. She analyzes how the contradictions of capitalism shape the modes and meanings of resistance in the era of revolutions and digital transformations. She's the author of 3 books and the co-author of the forthcoming Infrastructures of Empire with Paula Chakravarty. So, Jonathan, with no further ado, the floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you so much, Miriyam. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much. Good morning to old friends and to new friends here. I never got to meet Roger Silverstone. I was a master's student here at the LSE in the fall of 2006, in the autumn of 2006. And so I was an international student from the Philippines, my first time in Europe. And so I joined this community when they were in grief, in shock and mourning. That was a short few months after Roger's passing in July of 2006. Robin Mansell was acting chair. The first department event of the year was the book launch of Media and Morality, and a memorial to Roger. It was moving and affecting as a master's student then to see your professors, PhD students, the staff in grief, wistful and searching. It was very affecting to learn in this very environment, to see the people you'll grow to be in community with their heart broken, doing their best, showing up, helping others unfold their own questions. And I've held on to many of those questions from my time here. And I feel honored to be back here, sincerely sharing my process of folding and unfolding those questions back with you, and learn too from the next generation of scholars, students, junior scholars in this room. The first question I'll unfold with you today has to do with the current manifestations of the Mediapolis, what to make specifically of the many new international coalitions to safeguard the information environment. So I'm curious what you think of them. Have you heard about all of these popping up in the news in the past weeks? Should we participate in them? What's the best way to responsibly participate in these coalitions? Should we even join them? The second question is on the ethics of representation, which is obviously at the heart of Roger's work. What is our duty of care in representing the other? This is not just a challenge imposed by Silverstone on the media, but I see it as part of our everyday academic practice. We too are in the business of representation, in how our work is always already part of the public sphere, through our own micro-platforms and our own advocacies in manifesting a more moral or just public sphere. So I unfold these questions with you from my own specific position as a diasporic scholar from the Philippines, now based in the United States. My work is in critical media studies and ethics, centrally focused on the experiences of people in and from the global South. I use ethnography to explore people's judgments of good and bad media practices as audiences, users, digital workers. And I challenge usual frames in the ICT for the literature by painting a picture of digital users, workers as agentic, as cunning, entrepreneurial, and dwelling in morally gray areas. And my most recent work, as Miriyam pointed out, is in disinformation studies, but I'm not a traditional Polcom scholar. So I apply a transnational political economy lens to study the workers behind disinformation production. I interview paid trolls as a research method. I interview meme account operators, influencers, both anonymous and the infamous, enlisted for political campaigns and black propaganda. I interview advertising and public relations specialists in charge of political branding. And in the report entitled Architects of Network Disinformation, co-authored with Jason Cabañas, we share ethnographic portraits of social media villains in the Philippines. We retell how they're paid, how they're recruited, sometimes in deceitful ways, and explore their moral justifications. And we're especially curious to ask How do these people sleep at night, right? So this piece of academic research opened doors for me to enter the policy, advocacy, and media regulation spaces internationally. And I've been especially passionate to build longer pathways to advocacy based on this research. So finding ways for Global South issues and interests to be more centered in global policy coalitions. And many have been focused on exporting fact-checking interventions, advancing big tech regulation. And so I've been leading, collaborating with other researchers and activists to build the South-to-South knowledge exchange space against disinformation. And in November, in Rio de Janeiro, we're launching a new project on election disinfo in the global majority. And so we also want to empower precarious digital workers. So whether the disinfo workers themselves or the content moderators, we want to empower them to become whistleblowers, to expose the industry, and we want to lobby funders, to support academics and civil society initiatives focused on more sociological interventions that aim for community healing or even simply bridging family members across political camps. So returning to the question of manifesting the Mediapolis today. So what should we make of these new international coalitions claiming to safeguard the information environment? There's at least 4 coalitions that I know of. They have very different leadership structures, one led by Nobel laureates, another by our colleagues in Oxford, and many focus centrally on big tech regulation. So I guess the first question to everyone and to this panel as well, are these coalitions what we imagined when Silverstone first proposed his Kyoto Agreement for a universal media in media and morality? How come some of these look rather corporate? Some of these coalitions are very tech-focused, very platform-centric. And I remember Silverstone ending his book, Media and Morality, with a chapter on regulation and literacy, and how both are so essential side by side. How we need both top-down and bottom-up approaches to support a global and moral civic space. So I also worry about how a few leading advocates of big tech regulation, obviously we need it, but they have advanced what I feel are very deeply unsatisfying narratives about all evil big tech, brainwashing the populist voters of India and the Philippines. I think local communities find these platform determinist narratives very alienating, as it denies them of their agency. And I find more hope, and I'm proud of those smaller groups and advocates of journalists, tech activists working together that challenge some of these emergent and dominant global policy frames. For example, a few Southeast Asian media outlets and colleagues of mine challenged the new UNESCO Charter that has centrally lobbied for national governments to have more oversight on big tech. So from Southeast Asian experiences, drawing from that and centering that, we can learn how governments could be the biggest bad actors in the information space. So how should we academics responsibly participate in these coalitions? I think we need to show up. I think we need to have our voices heard in there, but it's going to be exhausting work. It's going to be risky work. Journalists and academics have been targets of harassment. Recently, colleagues in the University of Washington have been targets of freedom of information requests weaponized by conservative politicians in the US. Global South scholars, including those in this room, might have had longer experiences with harassment and censorship and compounded by structural challenges for fundraising, or having to compromise to make our experiences legible to the global north. So in the disinfo space specifically, it's commonplace to say that we need whole of society approaches. But what does that actually look like in practice? we're still searching for operational frameworks to make sure that whole of society includes also frameworks for fair work, fair and empowering collaboration, community care for each other. So how can we show up more strategically? So I open that up as questions. So my final question, and I'll be ending in a bit, is on the topic of representational ethics, which is central to Silverstone's work. How can we craft better stories that establish relationships with each other based on proper distance, the moral yardstick that Silverstone advanced? How do we use academic storytelling to subvert binaries of us versus them, of good versus evil, in our current context, in our fractious context? How can we better collaborate with journalists and other institutions of representation and storytelling to tell complicated and nuanced stories that are persuasive, progressive, inspiring, but also encouraging of our self-reflection? I remember the concept of self-estrangement as well from the work of Silverstone and his peers. So I have a recent experience I want to share with you. I have a recent experience of being canceled by some Filipino journalists, by a few of them, but very loud group as well. So they were offended and upset when I interviewed a pro-Duterte influencer for a podcast I co-host entitled Catch Me If You Can. So in this podcast, over 3 seasons, this is a disinformation whistleblowers podcast where we actually interview and you get to hear their voice, anonymous trolls, campaign consultants. And we see this really as a whole of society intervention. And we envision this as an educational resource to educate young people about the ways they could get recruited, and also as a resource for other researchers in the disinfo space. But for some pro-democracy frontliners, I think it's very understandable that they're protective of an ever-shrinking public sphere. This is triggering for them. It's unnecessary and indulgent, some said. It's like CNN platforming Trump, was one tweet. So I share this experience to raise broader questions. How do we open up spaces for storytelling that capture people's flaws, complexities, aspirations, including of perpetrators, but in a way that doesn't perpetuate further harms, whether intended or unintended? What are risks of academic storytelling as we are invited increasingly to participate in public sphere discussions? And as legacy media's guardianship of society center, the mediated center, Nick's concept, is undermined increasingly, attacked increasingly, how can we academics be more responsible and gracious with our media criticism as well? So as way of an ending, but really an opening and a further unfolding of questions, I do want to say that I think it's cool for our discipline to be front and center in many of these discussions and advocacy work. There's a lot of momentum in this space, and I'm especially excited about the next generation of scholars and storytellers, including those in this room, who can communicate complexities of critical research, ethical research, while connecting them to inspiring advocacies. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Miriyam. Well, I'm honored to be part of this opening panel. It was a nice surprise when I was asked. Even though I've been on the organizing committee, I had no idea they were going to ask me. So I'm really pleased to be here. And I want to start by recalling that at the beginning of Media Morality and Morality, Roger Silverstone mentioned hearing an Afghan blacksmith on the radio, BBC Radio, who had described through a translator how the attacks on the World Trade Center seemed from his perspective. And Roger Silverstone, then his whole book responds to the shock of encountering this radically different voice. And he reflects on the shared world that media make possible, on the value of connectivity, without which, quotes, the globe would be merely a shadow. And then he proposes that human beings have a shared obligation and responsibility to make the world more hospitable to those who are their others. But to be honest, and it's important to be honest here, I was always uneasy with approaching questions of media and morality. Personally, I'd rather say ethics, but we don't need to get into that difference now. Approaching them through the language of obligation or responsibility. And one reason was that Kant, the philosopher who was at the root of Roger Silverson's formulations, was a philosopher who tried to theorize morality in effect from the perspective of a disembodied rationality, separate from any particular social context, from any possible social context. Another reason for my doubt was that Kant's approach supposed that it was even possible to construct a rationally compelling framework for morality, but what if we live in a world of multiple incommensurable viewpoints? And that then led me to explore approaches to media ethics that tried somehow to extract from all that's completely unacceptable in Aristotle's worldview a pragmatic approach to discussing ethics for a world without consensus about morality or maybe even rationality. But in recent years, I have to admit, I've spent less and less time building frameworks for thinking about media ethics. And that's partly because, and Miriyam and Bart alluded to this, it seems increasingly hard, difficult to use so-called Western thought as the basis for developing any definitive moral or ethical frameworks, given its deep implication in what the Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano called the coloniality of knowledge. But another reason why I would probably not now spend time on elaborating a general framework of media ethics is because, in fact, of another insight that Roger Silverson had in his book, an amazing one. And I mean the very first paragraph of his book's preface, where already in 2006 he said that we face, quotes, an environmental crisis in the world of communication. He wasn't referring to the physical environment, he was referring to our communications environment. And I must admit, I was astonished to find that sentence again last month, because it remains just as true today, truer than he could ever have imagined. And it's this environmental crisis in media that, for me, undermines any temptation to talk about media ethics in the abstract. But what sort of crisis is this? The environmental crisis in media that we're facing today, I think, is quite different in detail from the one to which Roger Silverson was responding. He was writing about a world of national media whose integrative role, as he put it, was being disrupted by the globalization of broadcasting and the huge connective force of the internet. And that's still true in part. But in Silverson's book, the value of connectivity is always still treated as a positive, because he was writing before the time when connectivity, not just to central media, but to each other in our daily interactions, became itself the target of unlimited economic exploitation under informational capitalism, platform capitalism, surveillance capitalism, whatever you want to call it. And I can't get into here whether all this is better understood within the longer history of colonialism and capitalism, as Ulysses Mejias and I have argued. So it's extractivism, which is now the core issue for me concerning media and communications. And here I think my work connects with Miriyam's work too. An extractivism that's directed not just at data and content, but at human life. An extractivism which has had huge impacts, not just at the economic and social level, but on the organization of space, which was, after all, Silverson's broader topic. So the key focus today, I believe, is not the normative ideal of the Mediapolis in the abstract. It's the actual space for social interaction that has emerged through the dominance over 2 decades of digital platforms, especially social media. Through commercial platforms, completely new relations between information space, social space, and physical space have emerged. A completely new space for communication with some extraordinary properties, if we look at them not from the point of view of tech, but from the point of view of what I call the ecology of social life. Social media space is a space where, as we all know, we are always potentially exposed to people and content regardless of their moral and physical distance from us. It's a space where we don't move entirely freely, but where our movements are continuously nudged by platform design to encourage our engagement. It's a space where content that drives engagement, including bad content or content that makes people feel angrier, is directly incentivized by the platform's business models and the algorithms that implement them. And by the way, talk about the algorithms misses the point. It's the business models that drive the algorithms that is the point. And once we link these absolutely basic features of social media space to what we know from social psychology, from 40 years ago, in fact, about the preconditions for increasing polarization, in particular affective polarization, the polarization of feelings, once we bring those two things together, then it's clear that while today's social media platforms don't cause polarization in the first place, of course not, they necessarily amplify it for profit. And if you also assume that somewhere in the world there are some very bad actors, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that over the past 2 to 3 decades, businesses have created a space for human interaction that is not accidentally, but inherently toxic. And here I've learned a lot from Jonathan's work in the Philippines. Inherently toxic for the potential positives of political life, such as solidarity between people who don't know each other yet. Solidarity was a theme that after Silverstone's death, my colleague Lily Huriaki, who sadly can't be with us today, has written about here in the department. And as she writes, solidarity as something being deeply undermined in an era of neoliberal performance. And yet, solidarity is a resource that we absolutely need more of if we're to address challenges such as climate change. Addressing climate change, in other words, requires not only measures aimed directly at the physical environment, but also, and this is the importance of our discipline, it also requires attention to the environmental crisis in our media world, a crisis in what I call the space of the world that has emerged through social media. And that's the focus of a book I'm currently working on. We face today then a very different confrontation with evil. It's a word I never thought I'd use in an academic context, but I'm using it quite deliberately. A confrontation with evil very different from the one that Roger Silverstone himself imagined, because he was not afraid to talk about evil in that book either. He was talking about the need post-Iraq war to deconstruct false US narratives of political evil. But the need, yes, that's what he was talking about. But today we need to think about it in a different context, because we need to face two very stark developments. A world in which evil really does exist for us. Voices all too close that want to destroy the societies that have emerged from a century of struggle against patriarchal, racial, heteronormative and other forms of power and violence. And a commercially driven space of communication that, far from undermining them, sustains and amplifies those very negative forces. Zygmunt Bauman once divided the world into legislators and interpreters. In the face of this urgent challenge to defend something like a livable space of the world, I do believe there's a role for theory, that is interpretation, but more important, and I think this is what Jonathan was saying too, more important is solidarity. I mean concrete actions, not to legislate for how people should act or what they should feel in relation to media, we're past that now, but rather action to build alternative infrastructures of connection and to help each other, and this is going to be hard, to help each other gradually uncouple ourselves from the private commercial infrastructures that have become so dominant in our lives in such a short time. In fact, in the time since Roger Silverstone died. We need collectively, in other words, to build a better space of the world than the one we currently have. And so far, there are very few clear routes to doing so. But that's what I'm currently most interested in if we're going to talk about disrupted futures. Thank you.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. I just wanted to thank, first of all, the organizers for making it also a friendly, accessible endeavor for me to be here. So I wanted to also thank the invitation from the panel, from Omar for contacting me, Sophia, Miriyam for making this also possible up until the last text messages about where to get off. So I want to engage a bit with the topics and of course also the legacy of Silverstone, who I didn't know personally, who I did my graduate and PhD at the University of Amsterdam and the Free University in Amsterdam. Of course, we had some of the similar readings and literature. The impact was very international, I think, also Roger Silverstone's work. So we had also been reading him. So it's moving to hear also about your connections and also from Jonathan about what it means to come to an institution that is in mourning. So my work is kind of tangentially related, but also very interestingly, going back to the work, also sort of, it revives also a new connection that even after 20 years, whether it's on a conceptual level or on the sort of more textual level, actually still very relevant. And I would like to look at this through the prism of imperialism and settler colonialism, and mostly my work on Palestine as a concrete case to think through, but also building on the intellectual work and activism with over the years with Paula Chakravarty and my comrades in the Institute for Technology in the Public Interest, Helen Pritchard, Seda Gerses, and Femke Snelting. I do want to say 2 words about doing all of this very important intellectual work about radical concepts and solidarity and ethics. That there comes a time when you have to say out loud, this sometimes happens despite institutional support rather than with institutional support. I don't know how it's at LSE, but I'm at a university that's been on strike for quite a long time, and our employers are not coming to the negotiating table, and our response has been very punitive. So we are among those who get 100% salary deduction for striking this month. So I wanted to also make this part of a real discussion, that all of this production of intellectual labor is at times despite our institutions. And I think, I hope, I believe, I believe, and I hope to hear from you, if that's the case or not, that Roger Silverstone would agree with this. And I think he would be shocked to see the state of higher education in this country. So I wanted to not delve too much into the miseries, but go back to the work. So Silverstone's Mediapolis, I think it's really interesting to go back and to see how it really was about a mediated space and the idea that the media can create a global morality. And of course, we can have all kinds of discussions about what morality means. But in any case, a media that fosters cosmopolitan sensibilities, a media ecology that engenders a moral public opinion, which obviously 20 years ago, I think 9/11, the invasion of Iraq, Afghanistan, of course, the Second Intifada, I guess also in media studies, it was too early for me, but I'm assuming in media studies, this whole question was a kind of like, I don't know what you call it, whirlwind, earthquake, like these notions coming together, right? Of course, especially when you are based in a country. I was in the Netherlands, and our country went to war as well, especially if you are in a country that actually mobilizes to go to war, right? So I guess in the US and Britain, the Netherlands, these ideas about public opinion mattered. But you could say, well, after 20 years, like now fake news, populism, all this AI bias, is this not a bit naive, this idea of the Mediapolis? But I think that for Silverstone, Mediapolis was not just about aesthetics or presentation. It was not just about deliberation. He did really clearly also discuss it as a conflicted space. And I think it was about understanding these contradictions of producing coercion through consent and control, but also seeing space for resistance. So Mediapolis, kind of as a genre, is more relevant to me, as a genre related to conceptual junctions that are similar, such as the discussion or the concept of mediation in Marx's work. And I think, Nick, you've also written about the difference between mediatization and mediation. It seems like all debates, but actually they're quite relevant also today. So this idea of a dialectics between essence and appearance, in other words, where culture and communication are both contradictory, so very also conflicted, and also at the same time they are simultaneously something that conveys and inhibits. So there's a kind of a content in this media and culture, and it is about how it conveys it, the media and the message. So this ideal public life based on free debate and healthy checks and balances, I think for the approach of Silverstones are all about potentials. They are the potentials of the polis. And so I think in his way, optimism was there, but that also has to do with our different disciplinary, methodological, and empirical embeddedness. So I think optimism and the potential of Mediapolis is related to the evolution of communications, and the epistemology is built in basically the DNA through our own empiricism. And I think if you work on diasporas, and I think that was kind of also very much his invested intellectually in that. If you work on diasporas, as I did as well, as part of my research was on Palestinians, for the first time since the Nakba in 1948 were able to communicate with each other across different exiled spaces through the internet, that is something optimistic, that is something powerful. So it had to do, I think, also at the time with the newness of the internet and the emergence of mobile phones. And that's why the production of this kind of newness for diasporic communities had this optimistic feel to it. So I just want to correct this idea that it's not about Silverstone being naive, it's about the actual content and concepts around the communities and case studies we study that this kind of conclusion can be drawn. So what if we shift the prism from diasporas communicating with each other to more the material infrastructural side of it? So what if we move the prism from the inside to the outside, like looking up? So what if we look up at the infrastructures that make these Mediapolis? Now, Palestine, I think, is a very important case study and reminder, because if we look at what supposedly helps provide this Mediapolis, such as social networking sites, broadcasting, etc., corporate social networking sites actually deliberately delete publicity of organizations and groups of Palestinians, Palestinian campaigns, the removal of event pages, group pages, thereby erasing important archives of visual and textual content. So what I'm trying to say is in this colonial and imperial context, media morality as a progressive counter-hegemonic entity does not occur because of the media infrastructures, but despite of these media infrastructures. And I think that's important to know if we also understand how the destruction of media infrastructures in Palestine is deliberate, and it's what is called de-development, right? The notion of de-development, to deliberately not just stop, but also, how do you say, reverse development. So there's been plenty of very, very good, for those of you who are interested, reports on this by the UN and other big organizations about detailing the infrastructural destruction and damaging in Palestine. And often it's the focus particularly on broadcasting centers like, you all know probably the famous bombing of Al Jazeera, but also like electricity towers, internet providers that are raided, their hard drives taken. So there is a particular focus on the infrastructures that make this Mediapolis possible. So I think that's important for us to remember that when we talk about new media infrastructures, the internet, technology, in these contexts, we need to talk about the impact it has on actually making sure that there is no Mediapolis. I don't know if this was also part of Roger Silverstone's work, the negation of your own work. Sometimes it's a cyclical thing, right? You've done something for 10 years and then you kind of want to study the negation of what you've done. So I think I would like to hear if there were conversations about this as well here and with him. So I would like to sort of draw this to a kind of semi-conclusion by saying that if we return to Silverstone's idea of the potential, so media morality as a progressive public stance or counter-hegemonic public view that happens not because of Mediapolis as a kind of given, as this is the new thing that's going to be here forever. This is the transformation of the media infrastructure that we will all have Mediapolis forever. That's not the point, that it's a given, but it's much more about understanding the social contradictions and the dialectics in understanding these contradictions that conditions communication that matters. In other words, as those of you who worked on the Arab revolutions understand, when media transformations are in or out of sync with social movements, that's when you have a potential. So what you saw in Egypt and other places, when you see that there is a moment that there's a synchronicity between these media infrastructures and the ability of social movement, that's when the potential happens. But this has two conditions, if I may, in the last minute. This is to do with how we, I guess, teach, read, write. These two conditions should always be part, I think, of our analysis. That a critical media is about tracing the historical embeddedness and economic inheritance of technology in these infrastructures through capitalist and imperialist structures. I think that's a very important condition, and that's also, I think, what Nick was talking about in terms of his focus on the work. And secondly, that we need to really think beyond the center and periphery. There is a kind of counter-hegemonic critical global south approach, which I think we need to be critical about, and understanding the center in the periphery and the periphery in the center, and but also that tech corporations in alignment with nation states are often guilty of land dispossession, material extractivism, as well as displacement and impoverishment of working class communities through speculation and gentrification here. So go to the Silicon Valleys in Europe, go to the Silicon Valleys in the US, and discuss also what abolition means in those contexts. And so that's why, to come to the famous stickers. So 20 years later, when we think about ethics and when we think about morality, we have to understand that the discourse around these terms have really changed. And one way it has really changed is that they have been completely co-opted. I mean, if you think of terms like fairness, diversity, transparency, sustainability, inclusion, what does this mean where it's a neoliberal iteration in higher education marketing and business advertising? What is solidarity? When you talk about solidarity, what do we mean? I am in a university that is very in solidarity with everything, and especially with my health and well-being, but is still punishing me 100% of my salary. So, less, if that's what ethics is, less ethics and more politics, and that's why we need to end with, I think the opening was really good in that sense. And indeed, there was very good discussion of evil, actually, in the work of Roger Silverstone, but I think it's important to end with Gramsci's idea of the optimism of the will and the pessimism of the intellect, because we analyze all of this, but it doesn't mean that we then lay down, right? So it means that we dance on the ruins of big tech. That's what we do, and we imagine how things can be done otherwise. And so I wanted to use the last few seconds to show you some stickers and posters we've been designing along the years to make sense of this sort of contradiction. So if you allow me to do that, I'll shut up and let you just look at the stickers, just to acknowledge them. You can find them, by the way, on our wiki. And if you have suggestions, like Media did, we had a nice exchange about the misspelling of one of the stickers from ethics to ethnics. So that reads a bit weird, less ethnics. So the new sticker will be inspired by Miriyam, less spelling, more disco. So these are some of the posters. We, when we go to events, we do these super large posters. And then some stickers. And finally,
Thank you. Thank you, Miriyam. Thank you, everyone on the panel. I think we have been given a lot of food for thought. And while you're collecting your thoughts, just to throw a question to the panelists, which I think touches upon all your different contributions. You all recognize the polarization, the hate speech, the violence and extraction of the current media environment in different ways. And I want to ask you, who do you think we should be in conversation with? And where do we need to participate? And perhaps where we shouldn't be participating and who we shouldn't be in a conversation with? And I think that links initially to your comments. And I wonder if you would like to start with some thoughts, John.
So academics, and who should academics be more connected with? I think building up community. So when I talked about those coalitions and quite critical of them, not so much in terms of. So for me, it's really thinking through what's the best way to responsibly connect with them and build those communities insofar as what their advocacies are would be most meaningful to those who are most vulnerable, to those who are most directly in harm's way. For me, diversifying those spaces is so essential and so crucial. I would like to retell just a very practical example. So doing my work in the Philippines, obviously, being in a position, in an academic position where you have tenure now, you get to more meaningfully think of, okay, what would be the pathways in which this could have most meaningful contribution to the communities you want to work with. And so part of what I'm trying to do is to build a community of educators, storytellers, where we invite them to think of, new sociological interventions in this space. And I think that's so important to not just, rely on the usual suspects, not just the same old legacy journalists as well. I am much more connected with more community media outlets and connect in relation to what Nick said about alternative infrastructures. You want to make it much more diverse and ensure that those unheard voices get to have a space to contribute. I think, yeah, there's so much I got to learn from, inviting lifestyle journalists, entertainment journalists, comedians to think of new interventions. I'm, yeah, quite bored of the same old in our spaces. So I think for us to do more outreach is essential.
Thank you.
Well, I agree with that. I do think we need to open our doors as academic institutions and in conferences have a much wider dialogue with a much wider range of people. It's amazing how rare that is. I haven't got a definitive answer on your question because I'm just at the beginnings of this work. I've been very involved in the work on data colonialism, but just as an illustration, of how I agree with what Jonathan's saying, when Ulysses and I finished our book on the cost of connection, we realized, we were relieved to get to the end of it, but we realized that a book, what is a book? If the problems were as large as we were saying they are, then just writing a book is just scratching the back of the problem, that we actually had to think about practical interventions, and that eventually is what led with collaboration with a wonderful colleague in Mexico, Paula Ricalte, to create the network called Tierra Común, which is a network of scholars and activists, mainly, but not exclusively in Latin America, to address the issue of data colonialism. So I think that is the key thing. If the problems are as large as we're saying, then we're undermining ourselves by not talking with a much wider range of people than we're dealing. And none of us thinks the problems are smaller than we're talking about. So we need to get started on that.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. So I'm not going to say the same, but I do think it does also raise another question. I don't know if you've all probably here as well, of course, because you've been so glowing with your successes in the REF and the international algorithms of who are the best universities in our disciplines. But one of the things that is really happening is this pushing this idea to talk to the communities, and that produces a form of academic extractivism that is really worrying. This idea of you need to talk more outside the academy has become a component of like a metrics of to say, well, you get extra points if you show that you have talked. So I think it's also good to have a conversation to question this, to ask, okay, what is the point? First of all, a lot of people are bored and don't want to talk to you, so they're like, I don't have time to talk to you. Why? Is it relevant what you have to say or not? And secondly, I think it's about, do you have something that is valuable and going to change reality for people? If not, then let's not talk to people. Let's not waste their time, basically. But I think it is important to think about this also in the context of how this is what I was saying about the co-optation of these ethical things like community work, inclusion. It's actually also a very neoliberal metric. So I would say, let's talk first to each other how we understand this idea of communities and then do it in a real ethical way. But I agree. In the project on the 10 years Arab revolutions, me and my friend Hamza Hamoushin produced this edited volume on 10 years. And when you talk to civil society and people who are involved, they're really interested and open, but they want also that it's on their terms. So what we've done is we applied for funding left, right, and center in order to make possible the translations of the work. So happily, it's been translated in Arabic, in Spanish for Latin America, and last week we heard that the Hindi translation is finished. So that also is the question, right? What is the relevance and what do you give back? So we talk too, but you offer a translation, you offer this, you offer that. So I think that's, I wanted to take that question to another question, basically.
Thank you, thank you. We have about 15-20 minutes for questions. So there already, can I see there are a couple of questions, 3 questions. So we'll take all 3 together. If you can introduce yourselves, please, and if you would like your affiliation, if you don't have to. Nikos.
Yes, Nikos Tromikliniotis, University of Nicosia, Cyprus. Thank you for this inspiring introduction. Really opens the space for a debate. I'm concerned with thinking about the future in terms of the present there's so much dystopia around us that just to describe it, by the time we reach the point of reaching the optimism of the will, we have no energy left. So it's a real difficult moment that we live in terms of everything that's going on around us. So I'm wondering, in terms of how we can create, and what are your thoughts in terms of generating the kind of solidarity, the kind of advocates, the kind of activists that would counter the unsavory trolls. The rebels who will be trolls but in different kind, who will be the kind of, and to have the energy to do that, the kind of people who would genuinely have nothing but to lose but their chains, and that can invest their energy, their life's work, and commit themselves. But this requires optimism, that the world can be different from us now. And I see this with the younger generations being unable to imagine a world beyond dystopia. Now, we are living in a world where our work is potentially going to be abolished. My own boss told me, 50% of your work can go. This is the CEO of my university, because we can produce a syllabus using artificial intelligence. So what do we do in this context? And what is the situation in terms of the degradation of work, of labor, of those who are producing, how this connects to what you're doing? Thank you.
Thank you. There's another question in the middle. I think you can use the microphone in front of you. No? Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Vincent Obia. Just finished my PhD at Birmingham City University. Thank you for your presentation. Just to ask about, because Jonathan was mentioning about the Global South and regulation in this sphere. The fact that local people, for instance, find the truth that big tech is evil and all that. Sometimes alienating, because they use it for activism and also to find a voice in what they do. And also, you mentioned UNESCO encouraging national governments to establish some kind of regulation for digital platforms, but also the fact that also in some countries of the Global South, there are fears of that this could lead to maybe digital authoritarianism and censorship, and how that functions in basically addressing the challenges of digital regulation. And then the question about also the kind of, if we look at the global sphere and the move towards an agenda of multi-stakeholderism now for digital media regulation, and the power that global South countries have in terms of really having a voice, making a contribution, setting the agenda for what this kind of regulation would look like. So I don't know if you have thoughts on the place that the global South countries have in this regard. And just a question to Nick, because you mentioned the having actions to build alternative forms of connection. And I was just wondering, would you think of something like going back to the early days of the internet, of social media, where things were more collegiate and there was not the business model was not as evil as it is now? Is that something that you consider as a viable alternative to the current situation? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Gulale Khan, and I'm from Pakistan, and also an alumni of the Media and Communication School. Today I'll be also presenting in a session on TikTok and political narrative building in Pakistan. I have a question. I had two actually, but one was asked by this guy who said that if not businesses, then who develops the alternate modes of communication? But my question is more on, for example, how businesses have been very, very intelligent about first developing these platforms and connecting people, adding to the toxicity and everything, but also creating boards that sometimes, just like greenwashing does for climate change, I would talk about tech washing, which they do by creating boards where all these activists and all these people are on their boards. I would specifically refer to the Facebook Oversight Board that has a lot of representation from the Global South, including from Pakistan. And we have seen a lot of these activists previously talking about and holding tech accountable and big tech accountable, no longer speaking about it because they like the fact that it gives them a lot of exposure and also opportunity to work with businesses, especially the activists. So then what's the solution for it? Businesses are sharp, They're led by intelligent people. They know how to make money. They also know how to do work, which we're still talking about, collaborating and stuff. So that's a question that I really want to be answered. Thank you.
Thank you. I will invite all the speakers to address any of the elements of the questions that have been addressed. If you can be brief so we can have another round. Jonathan?
Okay. Sure. So on the first question about futures and dystopias and what should we do, thinking about like solidarity, what is urgent. So I think about this as an academic who's very connected with a lot of tech activists and also journalists. And I can see how the space is increasingly very difficult to work in. It's very political, very fractious. And I bristle at like some kind of experiences where it's like, oh, we can't have this because this is more urgent. And therefore we need like this very quick win, and therefore like this other long-term intervention, usually around media literacy, usually thinking about empowering communities in the long term, like that can wait. Like we need like this very big, expose to happen at the moment. I think both are needed. Both long-term solutions, short-term quick wins are very important. And again, going back to that whole of society, multi-stakeholder approaches, sometimes they kind of go against each other. There's occasions where those conflicts can be very felt, as I had also experienced myself. But I do think that there's a place for all of these interventions to be working together and more strategically. There's something around timing, there's something around, comparing notes and making sure that one is aligned. But as long as there's a pathway to advocacy and accountability for your long-term solution, and you articulate that and express that, I think I would welcome that. On the second issue around the place of Global South in coalitions, how can we make them more front and center? A very complicated question, and I think it's important to see how some of the these international coalitions, including some of the invites, right? Like there's ways in which they can be inspiring. To be invited to say, hey, we want to have very diverse representation here. More global majority as part of this coalition is really good, and we're working towards that. And that's why we're reaching out to you. But then when they kind of list their main priorities, some of their priorities are, around issues, for example, related to children and body image, for example, which are very valuable and very important. And I know many folks working in that space, but perhaps not the biggest priority for some people as well in the Global South, where digital authoritarianism is so much more urgent. So those, to kind of like feel them out as well and see how, truly sincere or performative they are in their own claims for diversity and inclusion. I'm sure there's more to discuss as well, but I'd love to pass it on to Nick and Miriyam.
Yeah, very interesting questions. Starting with Nikos's point and the Gramsci paradox, there's no way out of it. I think we have to become ever more clear about what the problem is. We can't just tone that down a bit and hope we'll feel more optimistic. The only starting point is to be as clear as possible about how bad things are. So I don't see a way out of that. But I think one place where I get more optimism from, and this goes back to Miriyam's very important point, is through the wider connections I've been building, during the pandemic period through Tierra Común. Mm-hmm. And as you say, it's crucial we do this the right way. Mm-hmm. So although it's slightly subsidized by some money I have access to at LSE, Global North Resources, I use that deliberately it's a completely flat network. It's completely open. There's no hierarchy. And if there is, we deal with that. And we foreground exactly the issues about knowledge production that you're talking about. And many of the people in the network are people who've been working for decades with indigenous communities and elsewhere. And there are no outputs. It's nothing to do with institutional pressures. It is just the group of people who want to be in the room or want to be in that network. And I think that's the value that we stand by. So you're absolutely right there. And that does give me optimism, because of what we're discovering through that different way of doing the reaching out that, as you say, neoliberal institutions subsidize us to do. But we're not in that game, and we must not be. As to how do we go forward, do we need to go back to the early visions of the internet? Well, it's certainly interesting to look at them, but they were very naive in many ways because, to put it bluntly, I think engineers and those who believed their language thought they were building just tech, writing code, but actually they were building what I call the space of the world. They were doing something that absolutely no human should have the right to do, which is to build the space in which all possible human interactions go on. It's an insane power that they acquired due to the bolting together of the internet. And so I think we do have to think in some way about dismantling that space that they built, which is not to say to take spaces away from other people, but we can't run away from that question, because that was the fundamental error that was made 20, 30 years ago. So how do we do that? Well, there's going to be an awful lot of kickback from big tech when it starts this project. And as you say, there are endless ways of co-opting our own discourse. A year after Ulysses and I wrote the book on data colonialism, along with many other people talking about this, we found people from Google DeepMind popped up with quite a good paper reviewing all the literature and say, yeah, we're getting on with it inside Google. We have ethics committees to do it. And I reached out to them, but I never heard back. So maybe the illusion of dialogue was just a hall of mirrors. But so we have to be, this is not exactly evil, but we have to be really clear about the forces opposed to us. And to oppose that, I think and it goes back to the issue around imperialism and colonialism. That's why I'm convinced that we have to take on this intellectual perspective of decolonial thinking. We have to ask, where does the authority to build our world come from? How could any human beings ever have acquired such an authority? Well, we've had 5 centuries or more of parts of the world claiming exactly that authority as the authorization for taking its resources, the world's resources. There is a much deeper colonial history to the types of voice that we hear from big tech. And I think we have to call it out and be really clear about this. And that will make us popular, but I think it's the only way to build alternative forms of solidarity that start exactly from that recognition. There's no compromise about that, in my view, which doesn't mean to say I'm not happy to talk to these people as people, because it's obvious some of them are troubled too. They're uneasy too.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm aware of time, but I think the question of the question of Gramsci, the question of the will and the intellect, I think it's important because it crosses all our disciplines and our works. And I think, of course, I'm not going to respond what do we do, because each context is different, so I'm not going to, I won't be able to give concrete suggestions. But I do think there are some broader observations to be made on activism and organizing at large. And this is another part of my work, actually. It's more the work I'm doing on race and anti-racism. So I've been writing about what I have been observing in terms of the divide and rule in movements. So I've been writing in Race and Class, this article on white privilege and shortcuts to anti-racism, if you're interested, and the new article coming out on radical kinship. Because I think, first of all, the algorithms matter. Like, are you privileged? Are you not in terms of your, are you tenured or not? I think that matters, right? In how you can do or what you can do. Are you racialized as a minority? Brexit, as we talked about yesterday. So all of that matters in terms of the algorithms. But the first thing is to support those who actually do something is a way to not contribute to the pessimism. And I have to say that also with the UCU struggles, I'm kind of like puzzled. Like, there are enough people who could at least support, even if it's lip service, because the affect is important in perseverance, in not being too tired. It matters. It's a very subjective experience. I had been organizing 100 times more 20 years ago, but the movement was very different. There was an energy that feeds back into you, and that the energy and the sense of like pessimism is not objective, it's very subjective. So I would say all those who are senior, who are privileged in their contracts, at least support those who are on the picket lines, at least support those who are in the movement. That's the least we can do, right? Because that's how we prevent for the solidarity not to recede. So that's one thing. The other thing is I think, the claiming solidarity and coalition politics, it ain't enough itself, because that's under attack. There is a whole weird, move for over, what is it, almost 6-7 years now, that began with a kind of, like, I'm afraid to say, I don't mean this in the anti-woke sense, but it is very much North American export into other parts of the world, that questions everything to do with privilege, and that questions everything to do with, that is very much color-based, so kind of like discourse around Afro-pessimism and others that are also influencing the way we think and do politics, and that actually, as a collateral damage, or maybe it was all along the intention, questions the notion of solidarity, seeing it as silly, naive, like how can you be in solidarity with me, because we're never the same on an ontological level. You can only be my helper or ally, or so that questioning can be stopped by claiming it to say, yeah, solidarity, coalition politics, that's actually fundamental if you want to win and not just write books in your ivory tower. So that's the other thing that I think I would like to say that crosses all the topics we've said. And the last thing I want to say is, and this is also because of the space I'm in, I'm organizing and I'm researching and I'm teaching in an academic space. That's our space, but that's fine. I'm not ashamed of it. This is how I also pay my rent. I mean, so what, others have other sectors. So I want to be able to do this politics in my space. And I think there I see the violence against organizing solidarity, because in my case, if I'm working on Palestine, the violence of adopting the IHRA, banning me from actually organizing solidarity events because it actually doesn't abide to a policy on whatever that we have just adopted. So I actually can't do solidarity work because it's deemed, whatever it's deemed anti-Semitic because it's Palestine related. So I think that I also want to say, solidarity would also be in solidarity with those who want to do solidarity. So if there are students and staff who are organizing against what disables them to do solidarity, help them as well to prevent that. So I think that's what I wanted to also throw in here. BRISMES is coming out. BRISMES is the British Association of Middle East Studies. It's coming out with a report, I think, next month, about the chilling effects of IHRA and the ban on BDS on academics and activists who work on Middle East politics. Keep an eye out to that, and then ask your course leader or your vice chancellor, what is this? Is our university also signing up to this? We would like to actually talk about this. So that's one concrete thing I would like to say. Solidarity is not just about doing things, it's also standing there for others who are doing the things that you can't do.
I love that.
Okay, so I'm afraid we ran out of time for this panel. So we will have time, hopefully if you have other questions, keep in mind that we have hopefully a comfortable long lunch break together. You can ask the speakers questions. I want to keep that energy, this call for ethics of solidarity and hope, and thank our three speakers. And